Welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have David Grew. He is a radiation oncologist and he wrote the Kevin MD article, How to Convert Medical Knowledge into Digital Assets That Work for You. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in Connecticut and did college in the Bronx, New York at Fordham, and then went on to do grad school and med school down at Tulane. And one thing that I did kind of along the way there was I worked for an MCAT test prep company. So I spent a lot of time in front of a whiteboard teaching college students how to take the MCAT test. And I always had a passion for teaching, specifically, sort of using simple visuals to get across complex subjects. Ended up finding my way into the field of radiation oncology. And I've really kind of taken that passion for teaching using visuals to supplement verbal explanations into my practice. So I'm in private practice here in Hartford, and I've been in practice now for 7 years.
So give us some examples and stories of how you as a radiation oncologist incorporates teaching into your everyday practice.
Sure. So one of the simplest settings that I use this is in lung cancer. So patients with a lung cancer can have a difficult time visualizing the disease, the treatment options, and what would and would not make sense for them. So sometimes we will show patients the actual CT scan, and that can be helpful sometimes, but sometimes the anatomy is just too complex, or maybe there's a centrally located lung cancer that's very close to the vessels. It's just not easy and obvious to see. So what I'll do in those cases, or what I started doing, a couple of years back, was just drawing with simple pen and paper to illustrate for them. All right, here's your airways. Here's where the tumor is. If we were going to do surgery, you'd actually have to remove almost the entire lung. And you're someone with COPD. You're already on supplemental oxygen, so not a surgery that you would survive or thrive afterwards. So this really kind of building the foundational knowledge for the patients with visuals to understand what their treatment options are allows them to sort of almost derive for themselves what the best treatment would be. In this case, it would be, in that case I gave, it would be a radiation, a non-surgical treatment for a cancer. So I've seen patients think like light bulb go off once they see it visually. Oh, I got it. I can't lose an entire lung. We got to go with this non-surgical treatment instead.
So you take that visual teaching one step further, and you talk about that in your Kevin MD article. It's titled, How to Convert Medical Knowledge into Digital Assets That Work for You. Now, for those who didn't get a chance to read your article, can you just walk my audience through it and share the story of why you decided to write it?
Yeah. So about a year or so into the pandemic, we still had these visitor restrictions where patients with a new diagnosis of cancer could not come into the oncology office with any guests. So they were there to receive all this information about their disease and treatment options all by themselves. They would go home, and then their family and friends would ask them, okay, well, what would the doctor say? The burden was on them to report back to them accurately what transpired, what we recommended. That's a huge burden for them. And so I started really aggressively making out these pen and paper explanations. And then one day patients started to ask to keep those paper explanations. The light bulb went off. Okay, this is actually something that's useful to them. Maybe I should digitize this so that we can leverage a digital asset instead of a unique pen and paper version of it, so that I could share it with patients at scale instead of, still always have the conversation with the patient one-on-one. But if they have a digital version of it, they can review it at home on demand. They can also share it with their entire family. You can probably relate to this as a physician. Patients oftentimes have a support team that's like 10 individuals between their friends and their extended family. So with a digital asset, they can just forward that information around easily and everyone can consume it.
So give us an example of the workflow of how you would digitize patient information so you can post it on a platform like YouTube, for instance.
Sure. So to be clear, one of the first things I realized was I would not be able to create content that was unique to an individual patient because of all of the obvious HIPAA compliance hurdles there. So what I have created was some of these pen and paper drawings, going back to the lung cancer example, converting that to like a 2 or 3 minute verbal explanation paired with, at the same time, a digital whiteboard illustration. So with simply drawn lungs, tumor, radiation coming in, and then a kind of a list walking through the side effects and expectations. So then once that's completed, that asset then can be shared by an email, basically, with the patient that they have now on their phone, and they can forward to the family. So it took me some time. I definitely stumbled and tripped throughout that process, created some pretty bad stuff at the beginning, but over time, as you practice and you start to see what resonates with patients, when you put them on YouTube, you get a lot of very fast feedback as to what's quality stuff and what's being ignored. You really get a sense of kind of what people are looking for and what's helpful to them. So over time, the quality just gradually improved because of the feedback from the Hive.
Now, give us a sense of the scope of your digital assets, like how many topics that you cover, how many of these assets have you created, and how long have you been doing this?
So I started doing this in December of 2020. So just over a year. We're in mid-February now. So about a year and a couple months. And I have created, I think, about 50 short patient education videos. The scope is rather narrow because I'm a radiation oncologist. So I'm mostly at this point, just creating stuff for myself and my own patients. But I have had outreach from physicians in other specialties, for example, cardiologists, interventional cardiologists who do TAVR procedure for aortic stenosis, valve replacement through a catheter. And so they have these repetitive conversations 10 times in a day where they have to explain this procedure. So they are kind of desperate for incorporating some form of a digital asset that they can preload the conversation with the patient with a short educational video. So I've done some stuff like that for other specialties, some stuff for urologists, but the bulk of my content is for oncology.
So you would think that something like this already exists, that you don't have to reinvent a wheel. So give us a sense of how common are these patient education short digital assets? Are they readily available? Do you have to create a lot of these radiation oncologist video from scratch because they don't exist? I was under the impression that companies kind of created these.
A lot of companies do create these. So I interviewed 40 or 50 physicians before I really started rolling with this as a business. And what I was hearing from them was that the sort of commercially created stuff often missed the mark. It was either just way too vague that it wasn't remotely helpful for their patients, or it was way too specific. So it's naming certain devices or procedures that aren't used in that individual's practice. And so it became more of a confusing thing for patients. So what doctors and patients were seeking was something that was appropriately generic, if you will, that it was actually useful clinically. And I think that physicians are actually very uniquely positioned to be the missing piece in that, right? Because we have the knowledge to know what is just too generic should be tossed out. And we also generally, unless you're being paid by pharma or a device company, you can keep it sort of down the middle of the road in terms of bias. So the doctor creator is sort of a category that I'm working on creating here in terms of useful bedside or point of care digital patient education.
Give us a sense of what kind of tools do you use to create a typical patient education video and what software you use?
Good question. So I started just buying an iPad and an Apple Pencil and then a quality microphone. So I use a Blue Yeti mic, and the software that I'm using is called Explain Everything. It's just an app it's a mobile app, web app, and an iPad app. It's by a company that was founded by actually a teacher. So it's really initially designed for classroom education. What I like about it is the interface is extremely simple. So it allows me, sort of the aesthetic that I'm going for is that simple white background with black ink on it, which is basically what me and most other doctors, I think, do. We're just drawing on that table paper, right? So you draw it out for your patient there. They really do appreciate the simplicity of that aesthetic. And so I'm not trying to create stuff that is very sort of computer generated anatomically, like some bleeding tumor in a lung or a breast. I'm just creating very simple black and white images, and this application tends to do a great job of that because it's for elementary education.
And in general, how long does it normally take you to create a video from scratch?
Right. So I have 4 kids. So oftentimes it's interrupted. But if I have about an hour to an hour and a half, I would say, of uninterrupted time, I can create a sort of ready to ship 2 to 3 minute patient education video.
We're talking to David Grew. He is a radiation oncologist, and he wrote the Kevin MD article, How to Convert Medical Knowledge into Digital Assets That Work for You. So, David, one thing I love about your story is that this is just another form of medical communication. And as physicians, medical communication is really the key of what we do. Now, if other physicians are interested in creating similar digital assets, similar to what you do, what kind of red flags, what kind of advice and tips can you give to them?
Yeah, good question. The mistake that I made at the beginning was kind of starting with something that was so broad and so nuanced. Like a common question I get is, what even is cancer? Well, that's a good question. It's a legitimate question from my patients. However, starting with something that broad is incredibly difficult because of all of the different sort of forks in the road along that explanation for all of our different patients. So what I recommend is auditing your workflow, auditing your weekly schedule, maybe for 2 or 3 weeks or a month, and see what are the things that you have said to your patients. If you said it more than 3 times in a week, that is ripe for automation or converting to digital. And I'm not suggesting that people should then go and when patient asks them that question, say, oh, you know what, I'm just going to send you this video instead of answering. It's more about layering an additional piece of knowledge transfer on top of the live encounter. So in that sense, you're not replacing, you're just sort of supplementing to improve the patient experience, to improve the efficiency of your practice.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
The biggest thing for me has been capturing my frustration with inefficiencies in the healthcare system and just beginning to build my own solution without permission. You don't need to ask anybody for permission. If you have a problem in your practice and you think you can see a better way to solve this problem, just start building it. If you build it in public, leveraging public platforms like YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, people will give you feedback live and you can make your solution better and better as time goes on. So I think so many of us who are disenchanted with the healthcare system in the United States are missing that you actually can change the way that you work with your patients, and you don't need permission from anyone to improve it. So that would be my advice, is just start. Don't ask permission, just start building.
And how can people reach you?
So I'm on Twitter at Dr. Grew. It's GREW. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. And I have a YouTube channel called Dr. Grew Explains Cancer, where I post most of my digital assets there. And then on my website, where either physicians or institutions can do enterprise licensing of all of my videos at primermed.com. So it's PRIMR, no E. So any of those places, and I'd love to chat.
David, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.